endeavor into the use of EPUC in the hearing room. So we'll see if that works for me. Hopefully this works as well. To get started, I wanted to do some stuff off the record to make sure that we're all on the same page as to what's going to be occurring once we get on the record. Last evening I received a filing from the petitioner that stated a witness order and witness list. Does everybody have that? Is this a good list? Is this a good set of timing? And I asked this question because I know Ms. Dooley only just made a little appearance yesterday.
These were good faith estimates of my real estate clients. I will endeavor to stay within the.
That was my question, was whether you participated in drafting this or not. Okay. I will note to start with that there are some time limitations with the hearing, basically because I have another hearing tomorrow afternoon at 2:30. I'll need a couple minutes to prepare for the transition to. So I want to try to be finished by lunch tomorrow if possible. The schedule affords that. I don't mind going later today if we need to, but I would like to stick as much as possible with the schedule as we can. The second thing, and does this document accurately reflect all the witnesses that we are wanting to see live? Mr. Waite, Mr. Hopkins, Martin, Mr. Busher, Mr. Kane, Mr. Wilson, Ms. Leon, Ms. Block, and Mr. Raphael. Anyone else?
To my knowledge, those were the witnesses that we were told the landowners would have cross on the petitioner side.
Okay.
So the other witnesses are not here.
Okay, that's fine.
Unless Mr. Thompson is willing to come to talk about bats. About bats. There's, Ms. Barton is just a conduit of information, posing as an expert, but she doesn't have the credentials, and it's her testimony just incorporates and through hearsay is putting his reports into the record. We would love an opportunity to actually depose the actual person who is the expert on bats. Because
yeah, I'm kind of willing to give you some leeway with time and question the witnesses that you find us in good faith to put forward. I'm not sure that drawing in a new witness and opposing them, which you've never had an opportunity to speak to before, in some ways you have to take the case as it comes. And that's what I'm probably going to say.
I mean, we've gone way past the 30-day period as well. This testimony was placed in the record, this report, and this expert doesn't rely on an opinion of another expert.
There's been no objection to the testimony. So.
That's right.
So,
excuse me.
A long list. I'm also looking at the filing that had the stipulated admission of evidence.
Excuse me. Could you speak up or use a microphone? It's a little hard time.
All right. How's that?
That much better.
Okay.
Thank you much.
Sorry. I have to get my wake-up voice going. Remember my Shakespearean times. Okay. Actually, more accurately for me is relating commands on the bridge of a ship. So I'm familiar with that, relating commands on the bridge of a ship. Okay. We have the stipulated admission of evidence, which was also filed yesterday with the sequence of documents on here, many of them with their EPUC numbers, and then the signatures of all the parties with the exception of Ms. Block and Ms. Leon. I just need to, are there other pieces of evidence that that we would be entering into, that the parties would seek to enter, other than these?
There will be cross-examination exhibits for Ms. Block and Ms. Leon, and I've provided copies of those to the court reporters and the parties, and I can provide provide them to you, they're not very many. And so the memo instructed that we bring, and I called the clerk's office to clarify that we bring cross-examination exhibits, but there are no other exhibits on there.
Okay.
Excuse me, we can't hear you when you're turning that way.
Sorry.
Thank you.
So the only additional exhibits that I'm aware of are 2 sets of cross exhibits that the petitioner is bringing for Ms. Leon and
What are
Ms.
the
Block.
nature of these exhibits?
The cross-examination exhibits. The cross-examination exhibits for Ms. Block are her discovery responses, and or a number of her discovery responses, not all of them. And then there are 6 of those. 4 photographs are cross-examination exhibits for Ms. Leon. And I could bring them up.
Okay.
If you want. Okay.
I don't need them just this minute. As
Okay.
long as I have them at the time you're cross-examining the witness, I'm
Yeah.
fine. I just wanted to make sure I knew what was coming.
We have not received any cross-examination exhibits for our witnesses. I understand there are some, but we're going to need time to look at those.
Okay.
And their witnesses are up first.
Yeah, we have 3 that are in evidence that we're using on cross-examination. We
Okay.
have 2 other, we have one photographs that we will be using for cross-examination that are not in the record at present, but we will be bringing in for the cross.
Okay, are those available now?
Oh, it's just a big board.
Okay, have the other parties had an opportunity to look at it?
No.
Okay, well, let's do that now.
And I just put, even though 2 of those 3 poster boards are already part of the record, I just put cross number on it anyway.
Okay.
I've put cross 1, 2, 3, and 4 for our exhibits. Cross 1 is the pre-filed testimony that has been in the record of Daniel Monks. I called counsel for the petitioner yesterday to ask if she would stipulate to the readmission of that, although I'm not exactly sure what the status of putting well, maybe we should do this on the record so I don't, because I do want, there may need to be a ruling on this, but as a preview, we would like to use that exhibit to cross-examine the aesthetic experts.
Okay, so you want to use Mr. Monk's testimony to cross-examine the aesthetics expert?
All 3.
All 3?
Yeah.
All 3?
Mr. Wilson, Mr. Kane, and
Mr. Bishop, okay. Okay.
And they would not stipulate to the admission of the pre-filed direct testimony that was already in evidence, which apparently there's some effort to withdraw that as
The town withdrew its evidence. The town withdrew from the case and withdrew all its pre-filed evidence.
Right, and so pro se parties were relying on that evidence. Now it's pulled, the rug is pulled out from under them.
I understand. You don't need to make an argument.
Okay,
So you want to admit that.
right, we have copies if people need to need us.
Are you in a position to authenticate the document? Since it's not otherwise being offered by the town?
Well, it's been in evidence already.
It's not in evidence. Nothing is in evidence yet.
Well, I guess.
All it is a pre-filed document that puts the parties on notice as to what will be placed in evidence.
Okay, well, I guess that we can subpoena Mr. Monks this afternoon and get him here tomorrow if you have an issue with authentic.
I'm not engaging in an argument at this time. I'm simply asking you the question.
Okay, I can authenticate it through my clients who received this and can verify.
Have you had any discussion with the petitioner's counsel about this?
Yeah, I called her yesterday and she said, no, we won't stipulate, and after I talk with my clients, if there's any change in position, I will contact you, and I was not contacted.
Okay.
And just, that's true, I was called, and my very first response was that there's no way that anybody here can authenticate the testimony to be provided for the truth of the matter, the witnesses to be able to do that.
But he swore to his testimony as part of the deposition.
No, he didn't.
There was no swearing.
He swore in as to the deposition.
Okay.
You know, I think what she has is his pre-filed testimony, not the deposition transcript that was pre-filed.
Okay, well, let's verify.
The deposition transcript of Mr. Monk's, I understand, is still in evidence.
That was already placed in evidence by the
Okay,
petitioner.
so you want his pre-filed testimony.
Right, because I don't know how you look at deposition testimony, asking him questions about his testimony if you can't see what his testimony is.
The deposition that was in the record was from Apple Hill, so that was from last fall. There was a more recent deposition, and that has not been offered into the record. I wouldn't have offered it. We would have cross-examined him, but Mr. Monk's, the town settled
I
in the
understand.
case, and so his testimony was withdrawn.
I understand that too, so. Ms. Dingleby, precisely what is it that you want to enter into evidence regarding Mr. Monk's testimony that isn't otherwise in a deposition?
His interpretation of the town plan and whether this project applies.
Okay. And you want that, so you want him to come in and say that? It doesn't say don't talk about it in the deposition?
I don't know what the deposition said, I haven't read it.
Okay, well, I think you want to look at the deposition first.
Well, I need to use this to cross-examine the aesthetics experts on the points that Mr. Monk's made, and if they are unable to defend their position in light of what Mr. Monk said, then I think that's what this court needs to hear.
I think what she's asking is essentially to treat that testimony as if it were provided under oath in this proceeding, and then to question the witnesses on it. That it hasn't been provided under oath in this proceeding. It's been withdrawn, and that's because the town has changed its position. So the testimony doesn't reflect the current position of the town, and then Mr. Monk's is not here. This is the first time I've heard that there was a consideration of subpoenaing him. And it's going to delay this case if we go down that path, but
I don't know what else you do when a witness gets pulled out from under us 2 days before the hearing. So, and in terms of the supposition that this isn't under oath and authenticated, if you look at Mr. Wilson's testimony, it is full of quotations from the town's attorney during select board meetings, conversations.
You know, I think you're making an argument that I don't need to hear right now. So we have an issue with regard to Mr. Monk's. I think, and what you want to do is, rather than entering into evidence, I think you need to reapproach this question, having examined Mr. Monk's deposition testimony. And if that does not sufficiently respond to your need on cross-examination, then we'll readdress the question. Because I'm relatively confident that in the deposition testimony, he restates the same thing that he said in his pre-filed statement. And that's that the deposition testimony is available to you without a subpoena. So you need to look at that. Okay? But we have that out there as a potential issue.
We don't have the deposition we did for Chelsea Solar on 18. What do we have in evidence? We never got that deposition. Was that the secret deposition they weren't invited to? No.
We never filed it.
The deposition, I'm told, was not filed on PUC. The one that you're referring to that basically restates the pre-filed testimony.
Yeah, I'm probably thinking about it having been filed in Apple Hill, because it was not filed, as I recall, in this case.
That's true.
And if it was filed in Apple Hill, then we can rely upon it because of the authentication.
It was filed in Chelsea.
It was.
Yes. Brad's Exhibit 25.
We have the white book.
is that on the list of the, so, but it's not on the list of the stipulated items?
It is.
It is,
It's,
so it's already stipulated.
It's exhibit CSBW 25 on page 6, near the top. All right, this has been in evidence, this has been in the record, it was pre-filed quite a while ago.
So on page 6 of this deposition, you know, he does talk about the rural conservation zone and the several criteria, you know, therein, and so I guess the content is there.
Okay,
And
and you can rely upon that in cross-examination, because it is stipulated to be admitted into evidence.
well, I appreciate that, but if the deposition was questioning this person about their pre-filed testimony, which apparently it was, because the deposition was taken September of 2017. How can that stand alone without the admission of the actual pre-filed testimony that was
Because
being
it's sworn
required?
to and authenticated,
Pardon?
and has a foundation, and is a deposition in the absence of the witness, and I will rely upon it.
Okay. I guess I'm a little confused because I'm being
Okay.
told that there are two depositions. One is the one that's number 25, that's from September, and then apparently there was a different one more recently.
That's correct, and that has not been, as far as I understand, entered into evidence.
Okay, but my
But you
point,
could, for the purposes that you articulated, the need for Mr. Monk's testimony, which is to cross-examine the aesthetic witnesses about the town plan, that piece of evidence is sufficient and authenticated and available to you. Having
Where
provided
would
no
I-
notice to the other parties of this need, that's what you get.
okay, well, fine if that's your ruling on the document, but that can't preclude me from asking them questions about
Absolutely
whether
not,
they
you're
agree
free to
with
do
it.
that.
And just for clarification, where is that second deposition available to us to look at? Has it been filed with?
It wasn't filed in the
PUC?
record, it wasn't filed as part of the case.
Okay, so discovery happened and my clients didn't have access to it. I
Your
guess is-
clients were noticed of the deposition, they were noticed of every deposition, and they didn't attend. And if I were to use that deposition, it would not be to enter it into the record. If Mr. Monks had been a testifying witness, it would have been to cross-examine him perhaps on it, and that's the practice in front of the board, with the commission.
Okay. I see, going back to the list of the stipulated admission of evidence list, I note that there was one change that was made by the department in Mr. Raphael's testimony yesterday. So what's stipulated to in this case, in the document, reflects the changed, the stuff that takes out the wind stuff.
That's correct.
Okay.
Excuse me, sound.
Sound,
not wind.
not sound that way, okay. Are there any other corrections to testimony or exhibits that are listed in this document? No, okay.
At which document, Your Honor?
I'm looking at the stipulated admission of evidence document that was provided by the petitioner yesterday. 8 pages of documents that would be stipulated to for admission of evidence.
Okay, I don't have a copy of that, and I asked if somebody has a copy so I can look at it, because my clients will stipulate to the witnesses that are not here for cross-examination that they are not agreeing to stipulate to the testimony of the people that are
Okay,
hearing cross.
okay.
So I'll qualify each witness when they go up and ask them to.
You'll have to enter their testimony in. Yeah. And it would be those elements, because I know a couple of them have 2 or 3 rounds of pre-filed testimony. You'll need to restate all those things. And are we clear, and are we comfortable with the current order of cross, that is the petitioner's witnesses starting in the morning, followed by Ms. Leon and Ms. Block, and then Mr. Raphael tomorrow? Any changes to that?
The only issue is that my clients can only be heard today. So since they're at the end of the day, I'm a little concerned.
Okay, well, control over that.
I will say, I think that the cross-examination time for Ms. Block, we may not have any questions. We've offered as cross-exhibits discovery responses from the homeowners association, and if those are placed in the record, I don't need to cross-examine her on those questions. The landowners have those. Ms. Leon, I would imagine it would be less, more, 10 to 15 minutes rather than 30, so that we use.
Okay. Okay. And we do have time limits that were established by the interveners that we're going to, I'll give you some leeway, but it's not like 3 times as much time. It's like maybe 25%. So instead of 30 minutes, you get maybe 45 minutes at the most. Okay?
Talk as fast as I can.
Okay.
We will.
Well, let's hope they answer as fast as they can.
Before I go on the record, I need to confer with the team about those photographs.
Oh, can someone pass them?
Yeah, we need to, I haven't, because we were talking.
Sure.
About it, we just said
Can I say off the record, too?
We're all off the record.
The commission has graciously scheduled another hearing at 11 tonight, which I've got to leave, so I'm not being rude. It doesn't matter, I'm leaving, but talk about lawyers behind anyway.
Okay.
But,
I appreciate that. We appreciate you reminding me of that. They're talking about it upstairs too, so we're looking forward to it.
Do you mind if we take this outside? Just
No, go ahead.
look at it?
Don't take a whole lot of time.
Thank you, sir. Yep.
I guess I want to ask a question. Are you offering it, Ms. Dingeldine, as a substantive exhibit or as a demonstrative aid?
Oh,
Oh, okay.
try this one, and if not, we'll do it.
Has it been have those three items been marked?
Yes. Well, I just called them across into, well,
That's fine, as long as there's an ability for us to track and identify those documents as they're brought forward. So we'll want to identify them by their markings when you start talking about it.
Okay.
And do we have, looks like I see lots of binders up here on desks. Do we have enough copies of potential documents that the witnesses will examine so that there's a copy for the witnesses to look at?
Our witnesses will have their pre-file testimony is available to them. I don't have any cross-examination exhibits, so if there are any additional ones that they'll be crossed on,
Okay.
we'll need them. We don't have them, and we'll also need an opportunity to review them. Are there any more, Brooke, any more cross-exhibits for our witnesses?
No, it's a four, well, this is three now.
Okay, I think we have it then.
Okay, good.
If I could ask, the settlement agreement that the town signed on Monday, is that something that's actually evidence in the record?
That was a question I had on my list too.
And I think we are, I don't know if the board normally admits the stipulation.
It appears to be in the same form as an MOU.
It is.
And I would suggest that it needs to be admitted into evidence in the same way that an MOU would be, and that your client can verify its authenticity.
That's fine. Mr. Wilson will be able to do that. There are conditions in the stipulation that relate to,
Other cases.
that relate to this case.
Yes.
That relate to this case as well, including, preserving the apple orchard, and there are.
It is irrelevant.
It's irrelevant, right.
And I was going to ask you if you entered into that.
Yes, we'll compare to that.
Okay. looked at EPUC yesterday and saw that there were no tasks for me, which indicates to me that there's no outstanding motions. Are there any outstanding motions that I am not aware of that have not otherwise been filed in EPUC? No. Okay.
I do have a copy of this settlement, sorry.
Ms. Dingeldine, do you now have a copy of the stipulated admission of evidence list?
No, I don't. Oh, you do? You do. Yes.
Great. Are there any other matters that we want to take up off the record before we go on the record? Hearing none, we're going to go ahead and go on the record. Good morning. This is an evidentiary hearing in case number 17-5024-PET, which is a petition filed by Chelsea Solar LLC pursuant to 30 VSA Section 248 for a certificate of public good authorizing the installation and operation of the Chelsea Solar Project, a 2-megawatt solar electric generation facility on Willow Road in Bennington, Vermont. My name is Mike Towsley, and I'm the staff attorney and hearing officer. The commission has appointed me to serve as the hearing officer for this proceeding. I'll start by taking notices of appearance. So if you could please state your name and your affiliation with this matter for the record.
Jim Porter on behalf of the Department of Public Service.
Jacob Clark, Manhattan Department of Public Service.
Sarah Sanders on behalf of the Department of Public Service. Allison Stone of the Vermont Attorney General's Office on behalf of the Agency of Agriculture, Food and Markets.
Brooke Dingeldine on behalf of Apple Hill Homeowners Association and Mount Anthony Country Club. And I have Aru Leon for the Country Club and Laura Block for the Homeowners Association.
And just for the record, I just want to clarify that Ms. Dingeldine made her notice of appearance came yesterday to serve in a limited capacity of representation of the pro se representatives for the Apple Hill Homeowners Association and Mount Anthony Country Club. Just so that's clear on the record.
And I would also like to add for the record that I am representing both parties pro se. I mean, pro bono. Excuse me.
Michael Malone for Chelsea Solar.
Kimberly Hayden for Chelsea Solar, and with us today is Brad Wilson, Miles Waite, Ryan Hack, Dory Barton, Mike Busher, and Mark Payne. Testifying witnesses for today.
Something I didn't ask that I should have when we were off the record is who for the petitioner is going to be serving as the, is going to be doing the cross-examination? Is it going to be primarily you?
Yes, it will be me.
Okay, so I'm going to ask that, in as much as you physically can attempt to do that, Mr. Malone, to direct your questions through her. And I know sometimes it's hard to do that. The same with Ms. Block and Ms. Leon. If you have a question, direct them through your counsel, rather than attempting to ask it yourself on the record, because then it's clear on the record. Okay?
If I may,
Yes.
John Einhorn, Natural Resources Agency.
Here's the check I haven't checked yet.
Thank you.
Okay.
Your Honor, may I make a motion that the hearing officer or the commission take judicial notice of the law of the case from the prior decision in this docket with the original application pertaining to orderly development and aesthetics in terms of the town plan, the decisions of the commission.
You can make that motion. I will not rule on it today. It needs to be briefed. And the other parties need the opportunity to respond to it. It's my understanding that there's no need to correct any of the pre-filed testimony. Is this correct?
That's correct. To my knowledge.
Okay. And the petition petitioner has provided an exhibit list that's, that isn't marked, but I think I'd like to mark it as petitioner's A, so that rather than reading all those things that are on that document into the record, we'll just submit the document into the record.
And I have that, I've just marked it as Exhibit CSA.
This is what, on its title, indicates it's a stipulation admission of evidence, and it's 8 pages without signatures of different items of evidence that the parties have stipulated to. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And it's my understanding that the interveners are not stipulating to the pre-filed testimony of the witnesses that will be cross-examined today. Is that correct?
Correct, or their exhibits.
Or their exhibits. So, to the extent that the list otherwise describes items that the parties have stipulated to, and again, I note that this petitioner's A was not signed by the interveners or by the council. So it is, I'm going to refer to it as Exhibit A, petitioner's A. I'm going to ask that a copy be placed in the record, but I'm going to recognize on the record that not all the items in this have been stipulated to. In particular, the pre-filed testimony and exhibits of the petitioner's witnesses who will be cross-examined today.
I would like to note that the stipulation was filed pursuant to the hearing officer's September 13th order, which instructed the petitioner to file a joint stipulation and list all pre-filed testimony and exhibits for which there is no objection into the evidentiary record. And that's what we attempted to do. I haven't heard yet any objections to testimony of the petitioner, and I would note that the 30-day period has well passed for all of petitioner's testimony and exhibits, so we can go through the exercise of introducing everything. I think it's going to take up more time than it's worth.
Yeah, I tend to agree. I think that your client may have foreclosed the opportunity to object to this, the admission of these items. That doesn't mean you can't rely on them and attempt to challenge the credibility and information that's provided in the testimony and exhibits.
Well, they're pro se litigants. They don't even understand what they were supposed to do in terms of objecting. However, it's my understanding that every tribunal in Vermont has the obligation to be a gatekeeper to the evidence that it allows into the record.
And precisely what is the nature of your objection to this evidence?
Well, I will go through it as we encounter each one.
Well, can you characterize it?
Sure, there's hearsay, there is lack of expert credentials to be opining about particular issues. Lori Barton, for example, is not an expert on bats. She is relying on hearsay information that she has brought forward. Brad Wilson, for example, throughout his pre-filed testimony has all these quotes of what Rob Wilmington, the town's lawyer, had to say at a select board meeting in discussions with the select board and with members of the
So
public.
you're suggesting that elements of the testimony that was filed months ago needs to be not admitted into evidence because of those concerns?
Absolutely. And those concerns...
Well, I'm going to have to tell you no.
Okay.
Because your clients had the opportunity. Your clients are not naive. They understand and have participated in other proceedings. And I will allow you full reign to cross-examine, to challenge the quality of that evidence, but it is admitted. Therefore, what's been marked as Petitioner's Exhibit A is entered into evidence in its entirety.
I'm not sure I understand what Petitioner's A is. I was having trouble.
That's the list of all the things that were stipulated to.
That we said we didn't stipulate to, and now you're saying
That you didn't
it doesn't
stipulate
matter.
to, but that you didn't object to.
Okay, so, for the record...
So we'll state for the record that they weren't stipulated to, but they were not objected to, therefore they are entered into evidence.
Okay, so I would like to make a statement on the record, if you don't mind,
Go ahead.
for appeal purposes to the Supreme Court, because, as I was trying to say earlier before I stopped, there is as a gatekeeping function of every tribunal in the state of Vermont. The rules of evidence require...
Can I ask you to brief this in your brief? I understand your argument. You've made it before. Thank you. We're going to move on.
I've made it before in another case.
But you
and
made
were-
it 10 minutes ago, and I'm going to caution you not to sit there and argue with me. If you sit there and argue with me, you're going to be removed.
Excuse
Do
me.
you understand me? Miss Dingledine, do you understand me? Do you understand me?
I understand what
Very
you're
well, then.
saying, sir. However, I have the right to make a record right now.
As you have done and as I'm supporting you in.
And what I want to get on the record,
Which I just stated, so you don't have to state it again.
I'm not stating what you stated. I'm not stating that
Okay,
this
then
should
state
have
it.
been done 30 days ago. What my position is, and what my clients need to have on the record, is that regardless of whether or not there is an objection filed by whatever deadline is created by this, by the hearing officer in these proceedings.
It's part of the commission rules.
As part of the commission rules, that does not completely foreclose and ignore competent evidence that all of this paper is
You know, you're
supposed
using
to-
up time that you might want to use on your witnesses. I understand your argument. If you want to write it down and make it in your brief, you may do so, then it will be captured for appellate purposes.
Well, I'm objecting to being shut down and not being able to articulate our
I
position.
understand that.
If you're going to throw me out if I keep talking, I guess I better be quiet.
I'm going to ask you to work with us to move this proceeding forward in an efficient fashion, consistent with the items that have been agreed to by the parties, including your clients. Okay, so right now it looks like we're up to the very first witness, which is Mr. Wade. Could you identify the witness, please?
Yes, good morning, Mr. Wade. Can you please state your full name for the record?
Miles Earl Wade.
And what is your occupation, sir?
I'm a senior hydrogeologist with Wade Heindel Environmental Management.
And did you pre-file testimony in this proceeding on August 10, consisting of 3 pages?
Yes.
And was that prepared by you? Would you like me to ask these questions after you come another oath?
Yes.
Yes, so.
Mr. Wade, please raise your right hand. Do you swear and affirm under penalty of perjury that the testimony you are about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I swear.
No, you may proceed.
Thank you. So, Mr. Wade, you have in front of you a document, rebuttal testimony of Miles Wade, dated August 10, consisting of 3 pages. Is that correct?
Yes.
Was that prepared by you or under your supervision?
Yes.
Is it true and accurate to the best of your knowledge and belief?
Yes.
And then do you also have what's been marked as Exhibit CSMW1, resume of Miles Wade?
Yes.
Is that true and accurate to the best of your knowledge?
Yes.
And then finally, what's been marked as Exhibit CSMW2, PFOA analysis report. Do you have that?
Yes.
Was that prepared by you or under your supervision?
Yes.
Is it true and accurate to the best of your knowledge and belief?
Yes.
I move the admission of the rebuttal pre-file testimony of Miles Wade together with exhibits CSMW1 and CSMW2.
Any objections?
No.
May I voir dire? Or before I make an objection or not, cross-examine the witness?
Yes.
Thank you. Mr. Wade, I understand that you have familiarity with the PFOA situation in Bennington, separate and apart from your testimony in this proceeding. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, can you describe what involvement that you've had besides your pre-filed rebuttal testimony that you're offering today?
Certainly. We have a contract with the State of Vermont Department of Environmental Conservation to do testing of point-of-entry treatment systems on homes in primarily the east side of Bennington. That work involves testing the carbon filtration systems, testing the influent and mid samples primarily, submitting to a lab, and managing the data on behalf of the state.
And when you say the east side of Bennington, what neighborhoods do those encompass? Let me rephrase. Does that incorporate, for example, the Apple Hill Homeowners Association properties?
Yes.
Okay. And could you describe very summarily what the situation is currently with their drinking water supplies?
Well, I must say that the east side, the Apple Hill neighborhood water systems, we do not any longer monitor. There was an agreement with the DEC that we would not do those, and another consulting firm is now doing the Apple Hill testing.
And why is that?
Because there was a perceived conflict of interest doing work for ECOS and doing work at the Apple Hill neighborhood. So it was a mutually agreed decision between John Schmelzer of the Vermont DEC and myself that we would forego doing any more sampling in the Apple Hill neighborhood. And there's dozens and dozens of streets in the east side where we continue to do sampling.
In your pre-filed testimony, you did not disclose that you had been hired by the state to work on one of the other parties' water supply issues for the DEC state of Vermont. Can you explain why you did not disclose that in your pre-filed testimony?
I didn't think it had any importance to the testimony that we were doing.
Did you disclose to DEC before you were engaged by the petitioner that you were going to accept that employment?
We initially did some work for ECOS back in February, and then we did some more work starting in May and June, and I think it was about in early June when we had the discussion with the state about whether there's a perceived conflict of interest.
Okay, so you accepted the engagement with the petitioner prior to telling DEC that you were engaged by them, correct?
Yes.
Okay. And then once it was determined that there was a conflict of interest, that's when you agreed with the state to no longer be helping the state, at least with regard to the folks that are affected by and have intervener status in this proceeding. Fair to say?
Yes.
Is there any reason why your resume does not include the PFOA Bennington case that you've been involved in?
My resume does not list all my different clients.
Did you make a deliberate decision not to include that in your resume?
To be honest with you, it didn't cross my mind because we were looking at more hydrogeology, soils, and what we do for the water treatment is nothing other than getting into people's basements and collecting samples, submitting them to the lab, and evaluating data. So it's a different type of work. It did not involve the type of opinions and consultations that I've been providing to ECOS.
In terms of the groundwater, how the groundwater is moving and migrating in this area, do you have knowledge of, based on competent evidence as to how the groundwater moves through this area?
I have seen the studies, the maps produced by the DEC, the Vermont Geological Survey. So it's somewhat limited in that I've seen maps provided by A&R, but the work that we did for ECOS we did not encounter groundwater. It did not involve groundwater wells or groundwater testing.
And are the water supplies that are affected, are they as a result of contamination of groundwater in the area?
The water wells in all of Bennington are contaminated by PFOA from likely ChemVAS. Yes, it's a groundwater contamination issue.
Okay. How is that different than surface water runoff or surface water movement?
There is not always an interaction depending on the geology. In this part of Bennington, there is a glacial till layer over bedrock, and the wells in the area are primarily drilled at 200, 300 feet deep and are encountering fractures in the bedrock. So there is not always communication between surface water and groundwater. In this case, the hillside has poorly draining soils, has a dense loam layer above bedrock, and there are no surface waters in our petitioner's project area. And the nearest surface waters are south and eventually flow into the Wallamoosic, and we don't know how much communication there is between surface water and groundwater.
Are you aware that the levels tested in the water supply wells, the private wells of the homeowners at Apple Hill, are you aware that those levels have deviated? Sometimes they go up, sometimes they go down?
That's the nature of testing at the parts per trillion level.
Okay. But can you, do you have an understanding or an opinion in regards to why we have seen some homeowners whose levels continue to rise and others whose levels have been reduced?
No, as I said, there are very few chemicals where we test on a parts per trillion level, and we also cannot predict Mother Nature. We cannot predict a lot of things that would cause the concentration on one day to be different than on another day. To tolerate a level, a range in values because we're looking at such minute concentration.
Okay, so the deviations in your mind, are they within like the standard error deviations, or are they a wider difference?
I'd say the deviations are within the standard that you would expect for using a lab method that is relatively new and relatively, it's only been in the last 3 or 4 years that there's been requests for use of EPA 537 modified, and it's an emerging chemical. The labs do not have a lot of experience in testing this, and so we're learning that it's hard to replicate results when we're looking at that minute levels.
Okay. I understand that there are filtration systems and also bottled water being provided to the Apple Hill homeowners. Is that correct?
Correct.
To your knowledge? Okay. And so suffice it to say that the well water in many of these properties exceeds the threshold for human health detrimental impacts, correct?
Well, I would say that it's the Vermont Department of Health's standard of 20 parts per trillion. Yes, many of those wells exceed 20 parts per trillion.
Okay. And given how new this science is and how complicated this site is, fair to say that it's very difficult to predict how this groundwater is ultimately going to move through this area, and whether contamination will get worse, better, because folks really don't know how much PFOA is in the environment.
Well, there's 2 parts to your question. I think we can be pretty confident in knowing where the groundwater and how the groundwater is moving under this property, and that it moves south-southwest. The other part of your question is, you are correct. It's because it's an emerging contaminant, and we don't have a lot of history, there's not a lot of data that shows, we don't know whether the PFOA that was in place through airborne transport in 1975 is still contributing, or has it stopped contributing? So we don't have the record to show what the situation is.
So it's possible, for example, that if some of the PFOA is coming from the landfill, that we may see that PFOA migrate downhill to the neighborhood and then ultimately to the Chelsea solar site?
Anything's possible. We just, again, we don't have the data or the record to understand it. And
have you done any groundwater monitoring or testing yourself?
for this project?
Yeah, for Bennington?
Other than the testing of drilled wells and the soil and the evaluation we did for ECOS, that's the only work that we've done relative to PFAS in Bennington.
Okay. So when you're talking about, knowing information about the groundwater, is that from somebody else's testing?
It's from the Department of Environmental Conservation website. As you know, there's lots of resources online, and there's lots of memos that are being submitted by the DEC, and I have access to all that.
So it's a work in progress?
Yes.
Now, how many acres of land is going to actually be cleared at the site, at the project site?
I don't know what the exhibit number is, but I'm looking at the map prepared by Krebs and Lansing under project area calculation that says tree clearing plus or minus 9.64 acres.
Can you explain then why in your report on page 2 you said that it was 6.377 acres of land that
Well,
will
it
be
says
cleared?
areas cleared, trees flushed, and stumps left in place, 6.377. I think that's the number we were referring to.
Okay, but you would agree with me that it's closer, that's almost 10 acres that's actually going to have trees removed.
This is what the number says. Total clearing, which includes areas cleared, trees cut flush, and stumps left in place. And then areas cleared that will be stumped, grubbed, and graded to consistent slopes, 3.263 acres, so it equals 9.64 acres.
Okay. So is the 9.64 acres the total amount that you considered in terms of rendering your opinions about whether or not the clearing of this property would or would not ultimately result in an adverse impact to the PFOA levels in the drinking water wells of the Apple Hill residential neighborhood?
Yes, we considered everything. We looked at, the first thing that we did was to gauge the level of impact that is proposed. So my opinion takes into account everything proposed, from the access drives to the clearing to the regrading. Yes.
And does your opinion include in any way the Apple Hill Solar Project in conjunction with the Chelsea Solar Project that we're here today about?
My opinion is relative to Chelsea Solar.
So you did not in any way incorporate, basically double the area of clearance, i.e. from 9.64 to 18, 19, 20 acres. And so you didn't account for what happens at the Apple Hill Solar Project.
We provided the services asked us by ECOS, which is to look at Chelsea Solar.
So I take that as a yes, you did not consider Apple Hill.
We considered Chelsea Solar.
Okay, so what's the impact of clear cutting the area of Chelsea Solar, and in light of the fact that Apple Hill is contiguous to this and right next to it?
Well, I think we could probably make similar conclusions in that the level of proposed impact, given topography, given soil, given the nature of PFOA, given the hydrologic upgradient location of the Apple Hill wells, I think we would come to the same conclusion that impact at this level is very unlikely to have any material change to the level of PFOA in the drinking water well aquifer.
Does any information or research exist about the tree benefit or retaining trees, for example, on the movement of PFOA?
There's no scientific evidence that talks about that looks at whether trees can absorb PFOA from the groundwater. No scientific evidence.
So then is it fair to say that your supposition that the clearing of 9.64 acres really is not rooted in any scientific studies or scientific knowledge with regard to what impact removing all of those trees will have on the movement of PFOA?
Well, I do know what phytoremediation is. Phytoremediation is the remediation or cleaning of water or soil through vegetation. And the way phytoremediation works is that trees and shrubs and vegetation can uptake contaminants from the water, but what those trees do is they typically absorb it into the plant matter. They don't process or biodegrade it. So when the tree dies and falls, that PFOA is still in the system. So it doesn't remove the PFOA from the system. It can maybe bring it up through its evapotranspiration, but it is not removing it from the system. So it is possible that even if the trees did take up PFOA, those trees now will eventually die, and the PFOA will remain in the upper soil.
Maybe in 50 years when the tree dies, fair to say?
We don't know. Again, I don't want to speculate on whether these trees are doing it, but I just wanted to let the record show that I understand the way phytoremediation works, and it's not like the trees change or take care of the contamination.
If I could ask a question. So if I'm understanding correctly, phytoremediation, if the trees were removed, then any PFOA that the trees had absorbed would be removed from the site.
If the trees were harvested, so they use PFOA on apple orchard, phytoremediation, they plant specific types of shrubs on apple orchards that can uptake the arsenic, but they have to harvest those plants and take them to a landfill in order to actually cleanse the soil.
Okay.
So in other words, if they are cutting the trees and chipping them and leaving all of the material of those trees on site, that's actually reintroducing PFOA. If there is PFOA that's been
I call it
absorbed. Hang on,
stasis.
let me-
I would not say reintroducing it, it's static. It's not changing one way or another over the time frame of a tree.
All right, if you don't mind, let me finish my question before you answer. So, as I understand it, and I'm a layperson, a tree sucks up water that may have PFOA in it, correct?
I can't speculate whether it would or not, but
You don't know whether a tree will actually absorb the PFOA.
no, there's no studies that suggest that they do.
But you testified that there may be a small increase in the amount of surface runoff due to the tree clearing, and that trees absorb and evapotranspire more water than grassland. Do you agree that that was your testimony?
Yes, I do.
Okay. So there would be reduced infiltration into groundwater and increased runoff to the southwest well, correct?
That's
Okay.
the difference in terms of without the evapotranspiration, there could be a small increase in surface water movement away from that site. But based on TR 55, which is an infiltration model that's been there for years, it's a relatively small difference between a grassland and tree.
What about the construction, excavating, bulldozing, contouring, all of that soil disturbance? Are you an expert who has the background and experience to opine about creating dust and thereby releasing PFOA back into the atmosphere in terms of the dust from and soils that are disturbed going into the air?
Airborne transport is, we did consider it in that, but mostly from a dust, a danger of dust from a construction worker or a nearby occupant, not reintroducing PFOA back into the atmosphere. That's not something that's likely, so it's not something we considered. But in terms of construction worker risk and say neighbor risk who's abutting the property, our soil data shows that the PFOA concentrations are well below the soil standard, the risk-based standard that the DOH and the DEC have prepared. And that risk standard is based on ingestion, dermal contact, or inhalation of PFOA. And that level they came up with is 300 parts per billion, and all the soil that we tested is well below 300 parts per billion. So I could opine that there will not be an air quality impact to the disturbance of soil from PFOA.
You indicate that based on your review, it's very unlikely the construction of the project with proper erosion control measures or operation of the project will cause material change in the contamination or mobilization of the contamination that would impact the soils at the site. Or the underlying bedrock aquifer and the drinking water wells that draw from it. So, you're saying no material change in the levels of contamination as a result of all the construction on this site?
Yes.
Okay. But what do you mean by proper erosion control measures?
That's an erosion control plan, which has been provided by Krebs and Lansing, and I'm sure is an exhibit to the proceedings.
Okay. So if those erosion control measures were not implemented, or they were not conditions of this permitting, they're given a permit, then there would be a problem apparently, based on your testimony.
There would be more propensity, a more likelihood if they excavated soil and piled it in a big pile just before a July rainstorm that could, move sediment off the property, and they didn't have silt fencing, and they didn't. Then there's a possibility that sediment-laden water with PFOA in the sediment could move off the property, and that would be an issue.
Now, are you recommending respirators or any kind of protective gear for the construction workers who will be involved in digging up this soil?
Not based on the data that we have that shows it's well below 300 parts per billion.
I'll just note, Mr. Reed, that you're beyond your half hour already, but if you have more questions, you may continue.
I have just a couple, Your Honor, thank you. Did you take into account the Willow Road construction in the analysis of whether or not either soil or groundwater would be impacted or drinking wells?
We took into account, again, the exhibit is the Krebs and Lansing plan that shows cleared areas which will be fully disturbed in a sort of pink purple color, and that extends down somewhere down to Willow Road.
But doesn't encompass the construction of Creek?
I'm going to object. There is no proposed construction on Willow Road. That's in the record. That's been stated, and I think it's misleading to suggest that.
I think what we want to do is, if someone can help Mr. or Dr. Reed identify the exhibit that is examining. I can see from here.
That's this exhibit here.
That it reflects the work that the project anticipates doing on Willow Road.
It's under Ian Jukes, and it's, I think, first.
I believe, is it Ian Jukes, is it under label 2? It's just project site plan.
Yes.
And
We evaluated everything in terms of soil disturbance. It's the pinkish, purplish highlighted areas.
And that's marked as what on the record?
it's CSIA, I'm sorry, CSIJ2, project site plan.
Okay.
It's an exhibit of Mr. Jukes.
And that includes that purple thread that you were talking about. That's beneath the project. It's like a roadway.
They will have to disturb ground for the roadway, yes, for the access way. Oh, access way, not roadway.
Have you been on Willow Road yourself?
I've been to the end of Willow Road where the gate is.
Would you agree with me? It's just a dirt path right now, and will have to be improved for the movement of construction vehicles on it?
Objection.
Yeah, I don't know.
What happens to groundwater when forests are cut, when clear cutting happens?
Well, sometimes there can be, because of the reduced evapotranspiration, there can be, water table can rise up slightly. You can have, more infiltration depending on the condition of the soil.
I have a question just because I'm not clear. What's the difference between surface water and groundwater?
Groundwater is beneath the ground, surface water is on top of the ground.
Okay, so rain would be surface water.
Rain is temporarily surface water. Sometimes, for instance, the easiest way to describe it is that there's a gaining stream and a losing stream. The gaining stream, groundwater moves into the stream and moves away as surface water. Losing streams are streams that actually the water leaves the stream bed and becomes part of the groundwater. So it depends on what kind of the geology.
Surface water generally flows downhill.
Surface water flows downhill. Groundwater flows downhill.
Flows downhill too. Okay, thank you.
One last question, and that has to do with, you were talking about erosion, when we were talking about erosion control. There is going to be stockpiling of soils that are dug up from the site. Where is that soil going to go for 25 to 40 years, and how is that not going to become an issue, as you were talking about, if there's a big rainstorm and then the big pile of dirt gets washed away?
I'm going to object. There is no evidence of stockpiling in the case. If Ms. Dingledine wants to instruct the witness and refer him to testimony or an exhibit, but again, I think it's misleading the witness.
Well, I
Dr.
read
Mann, are
it.
you aware of any stockpiling of soils on the site for the life of the project?
You know, often, again, I can't say for this because I haven't so closely studied all the project files. Often there is a temporary soil stockpile identified in an erosion control plan, and usually they're required to be stabilized, which means covered with hay and mulch, and it's often within several weeks before grass grows on it and it sheds water.
But you're not aware of...
But I'm not aware,
Yeah,
no,
yeah.
I'm not aware of any long-term,
Okay.
other than maybe during the construction process, any long-term stockpiling.
So if the reclamation plan talks about how it's going to be restored by the stockpiled soils coming back to the site, do you have some directives or recommendations
Well,
about what should happen to that dirt?
I would say that stockpiled soils during the construction process will be stabilized as per the plan and will not unduly affect water, surface water, or groundwater.
That's all I have. Thank you.
I just have a few questions. At the beginning of your cross-examination, you were asked about your employment with the state. My understanding is that you said that your firm was employed to take water samples, correct?
Correct.
And but prior to filing your testimony and preparing a report in August of this year, you stopped doing that work?
Correct.
Did the fact that you were retained by Chelsea Solar in any way affect your water sampling in terms of the findings of your how you handled water sampling?
No.
Okay. Do the homeowners in Apple Hill have filtration systems, or were you able to observe that?
From what I understand, and from the data that I've seen that's provided as public information to this through the DEC website, is that there are over 30 homes in that area, and they all have, or most of them at least, have point of entry treatment systems functioning.
What are they? What's the layperson's term for those? I think I've heard carbon filtration.
Yeah, the carbon filtration system.
Okay. And can you just describe them very briefly, and whether they take the PFOA out of the water?
Sure. I think most of the carbon filtration systems were installed by Culligan. What they do is they take the incoming water into the home. They add a new filter, like a particulate filter. It goes through one carbon canister to a sampling point, then another carbon canister to a sampling point, and then they add a UV filter, which kills bacteria that on occasion, carbon can be an area where bacteria could grow. So they add a UV filter, which is very good for the homeowner because it eliminates the possibility of bacterial contamination of their water source. And then that goes back into the pressure tank and is distributed through the house.
Okay, so I think, that was a long answer.
Yeah.
Does the carbon filtration system, the double canister carbon filtration system, remove the PFOA from the water?
Yes.
Okay, I have
Can you cross some of those?
Nothing.
Do any of the other parties have questions for this witness? Okay. I don't have any more questions for you either, Dr. Wade. I want to thank you for your testimony. You're excused.
just to clarify the record, I started asking questions. I believe you admitted the stipulation, and the stipulation included his testimony. So
That's correct.
I moved to admit it, but I didn't need to because it's on.
That's correct.
Thank you.
The nature of the objection was that there are elements of the testimony that are potentially questionable. That doesn't mean that they weren't otherwise admitted into the evidence.
Thank you.
I do not. They're usually in the binder, right?
Yes, if you open the tab to your name. Do you have that?
I do.
Okay.
Did you identify the witness?
Yes. Are you ready? Can you please state your name for the record?
My name is Thomas Ryan Hawk.
And what is your occupation?
I'm a senior analyst at RSG.
Okay.
Mr. Hawk, do you swear or affirm under penalty of perjury that the testimony you are about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Your witness. Do you have more questions
Oh,
for him?
I don't have, I
Very well.
apologize. I thought
He's
you-
available for cross-examination.
Thank you.
Hi, Mr. Hack, how are you?
Fine, thank you.
So you did some noise analysis and reporting in this case. But from my reading of your recording, you looked at a combination of project-generated noise and traffic noise. So what did you mean when you're talking about project-generated noise? What elements of noise were part of the project does that pertain to?
Yep, the project-generated noise refers to the elements that will be installed on the project site and operate for the purpose of the project. That includes the inverters and the transformers required.
So after it's constructed, you're figuring out this thing is operating now, what kind of noise, if any, will it be emitting? Correct?
That's right, and we looked at two scenarios, one being the daytime and one being the nighttime, because there's different, the inverters do not operate at night, essentially, is why.
And in terms of your analysis of the project-generated noise after construction during operation, did you take into account the time of year, snow cover, for example, versus leaf-on conditions? What were the assumptions that you made in terms that underlie your opinions?
The question's about project-generated noise, is that correct?
Right.
The assumption was that there was not snow cover. The reason that we don't assume snow cover is snow absorbs sound, so that would decrease any project-generated noise. What we looked at was really the maximum project-generated noise during the project's operation, which includes when the transformers and inverters are at full capacity.
But in terms of, so no snow cover, but leaf on, leaf off, what were those assumptions?
There's not a specific assumption about leaf on or leaf off. It's more that there's a forest that, or I should state more clearly, foliage that absorbs sound, and that forest was given a specific height that we determined based on our on-site measurements.
Okay. Let's go to the traffic noise. Are your opinions based on the existing traffic that exists in the area today?
Right. My opinions are based on the traffic noise that was measured when we were there, and those also took into account annual average daily traffic volumes for that, for Route 7 and 279.
So you actually did some measurements of sound levels and then utilized that information to derive your projections?
Absolutely, yes.
Okay, great. And so, if foliage absorbs sound, like you just said, how many acres of clear cut did you factor in terms of this particular project?
Let me find that page here to give you the correct number, because I believe, yeah, I'm showing 9.6 acres. I believe we were provided the same area that Miles discussed and was in the Crescent Lansing.
And did you, in any way, analyze the combined effect of this being right next to the Apple Hill solar project and the clearing for that project?
That was not included in what we submitted for this project, but yes, I have analyzed that.
So but your results here pertain only to the clearing for the Chelsea project?
That's correct.
And the analysis that you did, you're talking about for the Apple Hill project, that was also in isolation just on the Apple Hill?
That's correct.
Okay. Have you done any combination of those two modeling opinions to determine what the combined noise effects would be for both of these projects if they were built?
Yes, I have looked at that, yes.
Okay. And is that a larger impact than either looking at Chelsea or Apple Hill in isolation?
Yes, it is larger than looking at only a single one.
So the traffic noise that you were talking about, did that in any way incorporate the truck and car trips during the construction phase of this project?
No, it did not.
Would you agree with me that that would be the noisiest time for the many months that that would be going on in terms of sound impacts on neighbors that surround or abut or are nearby these projects?
Temporary construction noise will generate a lot of sound levels associated with the project, yes.
But you were not hired to do any analysis or to provide an opinion about whether there was an undue adverse impact from construction noise, i.e. excavators, bulldozers, chainsaws, any of that, the 18-wheelers coming in with the solar panels. None of that was factored into your sound analysis on either the Apple Hill or the Chelsea?
That's correct. It was not factored into this analysis.
Why not?
Because on similar projects that has been outside of the scope and I think typically deemed unnecessary.
Well, if you were living nearby, would you deem that unnecessary?
I was living nearby. Would I deem what unnecessary? Sorry.
To not analyze and determine the levels of sound during the construction phases of these projects to determine whether there was an undue adverse impact to noise, the aesthetics of noise or air pollution of noise?
Personally, I would prefer that was studied, yes.
What about the fence that now I understand is 10 feet high that they're going to put around this Chelsea solar array area? I think it's chain link. Is that your understanding?
That is my understanding, yes.
Normally with a chain link fence, are there any issues that you have encountered in your experience where noise would emanate from maybe wind blowing through a chain link fence?
No, we have never encountered that. And I also asked the manufacturer of I guess it was the screening material, if they have ever encountered that or had any information about that, and they could not provide any.
So it's an unknown, so you feel comfortable that the actual fence itself would not be party to impacts, but with the plastic or mesh or whatever this sheathing is, it's going to be big black, stuff that's going to be wrapped or connected to this fence. You were not able to obtain any information from the manufacturer to determine whether there would or would not be any sound impacts from that?
No, they could not provide that. They merely suggested that if there was going to be a great deal of wind passing through it, that the mesh material should allow air to pass through it and not be like a sheet of canvas. Rather, it's more of a mesh. And I believe that's what's been prescribed here.
So if the wind goes through this mesh, did you do any modeling to determine whether it would cause any sound?
No, we have not, and I have no reason to expect that it would create any more sound than the sound of the wind through the trees that used to be in that location.
Would you agree with me that construction noise from the two projects, if you looked at them in conjunction with one another, either there would be an impact from the construction noise that is more significant than the traffic noise study that you did as a standalone proposition for Chelsea Solar, or Apple Hill in isolation from one another?
That's kind of difficult to offer because first you use the word significant, which has a specific meaning, and it's not really applicable. Second, I don't understand the difference. Well, let me say it this way. Any construction noise impact, when considering both projects, would most likely be temporal in nature, and that it's going to take twice as much time. But my understanding is they're not going to be constructed together. I have no reason to believe they will. They're separate projects.
I see. So it's your belief that the construction of these two projects would not be happening simultaneously?
Correct.
Okay. If they were going to happen simultaneously, would you agree with me that it conceivably would double the noise?
If there were two sets of equipment, or if there was a set of equipment on each project site operating simultaneously, yes, that would generate more noise than a single project.
And if they were not done simultaneously, then obviously, we would have a longer duration, perhaps double the duration of that kind of construction. Is fair to say?
Compared to a single project, yes, that's correct.
That's all I have, Your Honor.
Yes, you were asked some questions about the combined effect of clearing for both Chelsea and Apple Hill tree clearing, and the impact that may have on sound generated by vehicles traveling along Route 7. I'd like to refer you to your testimony at pages 4 and 5, the bottom of 4 and top of 5.
Which testimony are you referring to?
It's the November 27, 2017 testimony. If you could just read starting on line 18, page 4, and continue on to your conclusion on the following page.
You're asking me to read page 4 or 5, starting at line 18?
Page 4, line 18.
With a report that details the results?
Yes.
Okay, I can
And
read.
you don't need to read it out loud. I just
Oh.
want to refresh your memory to read it.
Okay.
Okay, having that in mind, and there your conclusion is that with respect to Chelsea, that the noise levels would be, any increase would be barely be perceptible, let alone substantial adverse or unduly adverse, correct?
Correct.
And is that, you said you looked at both projects together, do you have the same or a different conclusion with respect to noise levels from the combined projects?
The conclusion is the same. The noise level, or the noise level from traffic is slightly higher. I believe it was less than 1 dB above what we modeled here, but the overarching conclusion is the same.
Just one question in that regard. Did your modeling include the potential sound deadening effect of the panels themselves?
No, I don't believe the panels will absorb all that much sound, and no, it did not include them.
Okay, thank you. As a general rule, they are a physical structure.
Many apologies. Do not pay attention to the man behind the bench.
I forgot what I was asking.
You were asking about panels and them being a structure.
Yes, are there any studies that indicate whether or not solar, and this is just for my general knowledge, that you know, a 10-acre solar field with densely mounted panels that are 10 feet high, have there been studies that indicate whether or not those structures act in the same way as a building might in terms of absorbing or blocking sound?
There are no studies that I'm aware of for solar panels.
Okay, thank you.
Can I just ask you a follow-up on that? You make a statement about, on page 4, about considerable attenuation potentially provided by the solar arrays. Can you explain the difference between what you mean by attenuation and the absorbing discussion that you were just having with the hearing officer?
Sure. So attenuation essentially just describes noise that does not arrive at a receiver that was generated somewhere else. And so that could be accomplished through absorbing sound. It could be accomplished through blocking sound. But attenuation is just the general sense of sound no longer arriving somewhere. So it could be absorbed by air. It could be absorbed by the ground. It could be absorbed by trees. It could be blocked by barriers or what have you.
Could it be redirected?
Yes, it could be reflected as well.
Okay. I have nothing further.
Well, so is reflecting on that, you indicated there's no studies that have done this, but what do you think? You know, if you were to have the opportunity to conduct a study, what do you think the results might be?
I would certainly expect the panels to create a form of a barrier, and that their effectiveness as a barrier would most certainly be a function of the orientation. So if you stood on the side of them and looked down, or you stood behind the panels, that would be different. They are most certainly going to scatter the sound, and any reflections would create a longer path for the sound to travel before it reached the receiver, so it would, in that sense, also act as a barrier.
And attenuate.
And attenuate or decrease any received sound.
Other questions?
The modeling that you did was based on what configuration? The one that is on the site plan right now, where the panels were squished together closer, or was your sound study based on the original application?
No, our study was based on the clearing area in the existing application, and just to clarify, we did not include any sort of structure or barrier to represent the panels. They were represented by semi-porous ground, which is a ground absorption factor of 0.7, which is extremely conservative.
Okay, and so when you were talking about sound attenuation, does this will act as some kind of barrier? Where does the sound go? Does it fall off to the side? Does it go up?
It would reflect, and that's all dependent on the angle from which the sound is approaching the barrier, since the panels are angled, and if sound was coming directly from in front of them, or from the south in this case, it would be reflected up. If it was coming from the east, it would be reflected straight into the ground.
And one other question, you were asked about the last statement you made in that pre-file testimony about a 3 dB increase in sound level is not considered substantial by the Vermont Noise Analysis and Abatement Policy. What level is considered substantial increase?
I believe it's a 15 dB increase, and that's specifically in the context of Type 1 highway projects.
What about the construction noise? How many decibels is that going to increase the ambient noise during the construction phase with all of those heavy equipment and chainsaws?
Yep.
And all that?
I can't say we looked at how much it's going to increase the ambient noise. What we did look at was some general distances of residences from the construction site. And if I remember correctly, the range of, at the closest tree clearing boundary to a residence is about 100 meters. And at that range, I think of the several types of construction equipment that we modeled, from trucks to chainsaws and chippers, I think the range, if I remember correctly, was about 55 to 70 dBA.
Okay, so significantly over the 15 dBA or dB.
Well, that's a traffic. They're different. You're comparing apples to oranges. One's traffic noise, one is a construction noise source.
Okay. Would you consider, and you're telling me that you didn't model for Chelsea or for Apple Hill on construction, but you're talking about your general knowledge of this? Or
No,
did
I
you
said that.
model this?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the end of that, or
Or did you model construction noise for this project or Apple Hill?
We were asked to look at it for this project after we submitted this testimony.
And were you not then asked to produce a report based on your findings?
We were not, because it was never asked about in the, as far as I know, in rebuttals and whatnot.
Would you agree with me that it's the applicant's duty to at least provide affirmative evidence on aesthetics or sufficient evidence on air pollution with regard to noise, which should encompass all aspects of the project?
I'd say that's fair to say. I do think there's a direct comparison that you could make to Apple Hill, in that we did not look at construction noise for that. And so we didn't look at it for this project because it was not specifically asked.
So, in your expert opinion, do you believe that it would have been appropriate for you to have modeled that information and then reported it to provide a comprehensive and sound analysis that addresses either the aesthetic or the air pollution criteria for noise?
I do personally think it should be included. The caveat there is that we're talking about two different types of noise impacts. Construction noise is a temporary noise impact. That is something that is accepted by our society to be able to make progress and get past it. What we considered for the project most specifically was the lasting impact. What is the what the noise will generate by the project and what the overall impact on background sound levels will be.
But fair to say that the construction of just this project would take several months, and the proposed time frame for the construction is Monday to Friday, 8 to 5. Other work at other times that isn't as noisy on weekends, but it is a substantial amount of time that temporary, other work at other times that isn't as noisy on weekends, but it is a substantial amount of time that temporary, quote-unquote, noise impact would exist, times two, given the other project that you indicated would double the time period probably for the construction noise period.
Sure.
Okay, that's all I have, thank you.
I do have a redirect. When did you prepare this or undertake this analysis of the construction impact, potential construction impact on this?
It would have been within the last month,
Okay. And,
maybe two.
okay. And, have you worked on other projects, related to solar development?
Yes.
And to your knowledge, is the construction, the type of construction equipment that's being considered here and that you consider similar to that was involved with respect to other solar projects?
Yes, it was similar.
And to your knowledge, have those other solar projects received certificates of public good?
Yes.
Any cross?
Despite the fact that you did the groundwork, you weren't asked to report on it, right?
I think the case was more that by the time we completed the study, it was too late to submit it. I do believe that if we would have been asked to do that in some rebuttal from the interveners, that it would have been submitted with my rebuttal testimony, but we could not specifically report that because it was not specifically asked about.
You would agree with me, though, that the burden of proof for the applicant is the burden of proof regardless of what somebody brings up on some kind of rebuttal testimony or you know, what they bring up as a landowner in the area.
This is getting into legal opinions.
Yeah, I'm gonna sustain the objection. You're asking his legal opinion on what the quality of the burden of proof is. I'm not sure that's within his area of expertise.
It is
So
not.
I'm gonna sustain the objection.
Okay, then I'll just so we're clear, you believe that the noise impacts from the construction should have been reported and provided to this tribunal in order to provide a comprehensive and adequate study of all of the noise impacts from this project. Fair to say?
That is fair to say, but I will add that having done an analysis, it does not change my professional opinion on the matter.
Well, that, we don't have any information from you because it wasn't submitted to test that theory to understand what level of sound, how that impact would actually be experienced by the people around there. Fair to say?
Okay.
Thank you.
And I believe, just to redirect you, Mr. Hack, you did say that you reported a number that in your prior testimony. I think it was
Objection, leading.
You reported a number under oath in response to questions from Ms. Singelback, correct?
Just now?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. And with respect to the other projects that you've worked on, is a noise study for temporary construction noise typically requested of you and typically included in the record before the Public Utility Commission?
I would say it has been, but typically it is not.
Okay. Thank you.
Parties have any additional questions for this witness?
Because they want to save money. Fair to say?
Objection.
Sustained. Mr. Hucker, I thank you for your testimony. You're excused. It's now 10 minutes after 11. We will take a break until 11:25. Ms. Barton is on stand, and that she's been allotted 60 minutes, or that the interviewers have been allotted 60 minutes for her cross-examination. I would like to take a lunch break at the end of that period. So let's go for an hour or so, and then we'll take lunch.
Actually, Your Honor, I think it'll be much shorter than that.
Okay, well then, be sure then we'll take lunch after that.
Thank you.
And then have Mr. Busher in the afternoon. Okay. With that, if we could introduce the witness.
Good morning, Ms. Barton. Can you please state your full name for the record?
Dora Barton.
And what is your employment?
I work with Arrowwood Environmental.
Thank you.
Ms. Barton, do you swear or affirm under penalty of perjury that the testimony you are about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
The witness is free to be cross-examined.
Hey, Ms. Barton, how are you?
Good morning.
You're a wetland scientist primarily, is that right?
So my title is wetland ecologist, which is probably more descriptive of my passion. If you actually look at my educational background and what I do on a daily basis for my work, it's much broader than that and much more multidisciplinary. But wetland ecologist is kind of where I started and kind of where my love is.
So the
Wildlife issues here, there was, you provided some testimony originally that said that it didn't appear that any bat studies were required or necessary. That was in your original pre-file testimony. You recall giving that opinion?
Right, that's when we were looking at Chelsea Solar individually, and so then what I believe it was the agency requested that we, as far as the clearing is concerned, total that together when making an assessment about whether additional bat surveys would be required. And when you add the clearing for both projects together, then the trigger is met. And so that's why there was a difference in opinion about what our next steps would be. And when you combine the projects together, then we exceed the amount that doesn't require the acoustic surveys.
Is that an acreage amount of clearing, or?
It's funny. It's a percentage actually. If you clear more than 1% of the forest of the surrounding 1 square mile, so it's not an acreage because the amount of forest in a square mile is variable, and so we essentially have to identify all of the forested areas within 1 square mile, and then we do a ratio essentially of what the clearing is, and we figure out whether we are above or below 1%.
I see. And so, so you determined that it was 0.78%, which is less than 1% initially, and that's why you determined it was not required at that point.
That was just for Chelsea, right?
Right.
And then when you add Apple Hill in, you go above.
Okay. So in terms of your experience on bat surveys, let's just get right to the point. Have you had any background or educational learning or experience, any other courses outside of your normal discipline in college in terms of how to conduct surveys of bats or birds or any of these kinds of wildlife?
So it was in 2015 that northern long-eared bat was listed, was federally listed, and shortly thereafter, the Department of Fish and Wildlife offered training for consultants, and I believe foresters were invited as well, that I attended, and it was essentially running through, the new world of bats, and in terms of the acoustic surveys, what methodologies we would use, and kind of requirements related to that. And I attended that, others in my office attended that. I believe actually the gentleman that we subcontract the actual acoustic surveys was there. With white nose syndrome and recent development, bats have certainly become a bigger part of our work and our world, not necessarily so back in the 90s when I was doing my master's work. But I've certainly, with many things, keep up with the trainings and have, practical experience working with the folks that conduct the surveys. I haven't actually conducted an acoustic bat survey using the equipment, but as project manager, I have for this project and for other projects been in charge of reviewing the work plans that get submitted and approved to the state of Vermont, serve as contact person. And again, work with the folks. Either we've used Allen, such as this case. We've worked with Stantec before, and manage that. It's a component of the project, but I'm as the lead ecologist on the scene. I'm in charge of looking at how all the pieces fit together as far as our resource assessment goes.
As part of the materials that you provided, along with Mr. Thompson's CV, he seems to have some status or certification for doing bat surveys. Is that what I'm looking at from the Agency of Natural Resources?
What are you looking at?
It's Mr. Thompson's resume that's Exhibit CS-DB. Resume of Alan Thompson.
Is that the one page?
It's one page, and then there are some other papers after that.
Right.
That show notification question of eligibility status. It says in the middle of the page comments, Alan Thompson meets all eligibility requirements for conducting threatened and endangered bat surveys in the state of Vermont, and it has a eligibility status period from 2017 to 2022. Is that what I'm looking at? Like A&R, he went through some training with them and they gave him a thumbs up that he was certified to do these kinds of studies?
The permit that you're looking at is something we actually acquire them. We don't have one for doing bat surveys, but we have one for doing rare plant surveys. And so because the nature of the work is such that we're dealing with threatened and endangered federally listed species sometimes, the folks that obtain these permits essentially have the approval to do their work without violating the rules and regulations of federal guidelines. So it's similar to a takings permit, and for the rare plants, sometimes our biologists may need to take a sample of a plant for identification purposes. But the average person who doesn't have this permit cannot just walk out and take a sample. And so it's a requirement to do the work for the bat surveys. Now, as to your question about his qualifications, I'm certain that plays into the obtaining this permit.
Okay, so to do one of these surveys, A&R needs to issue a permit to allow someone to do it in a specific location or property or what have you.
Well, so the way this works, this is giving him authorization for a period of time to conduct the surveys. But it's not site specific. No, site specific. When you go site specific, we provide work plans for approval for the specific project. And so those go into Fish and Wildlife. So there was a work plan for this project, site specific.
And because he has this credential, during this time frame, he can apply to do that site-specific work. Is that accurate?
We're not actually applying to do the work. We're getting the work authorized. I mean, we certainly want to have the work plan. It's almost getting a stamp of approval so that when we're in this proceeding, we all know that the work was done properly per the guidelines to conduct those acoustic surveys. And so the work plan is submitted for review and approval by Fish and Wildlife.
Do you have this similar type of eligibility status approval for any kind of bat surveying?
To do this for the acoustic bat surveys? No, that's why we set a contract
That's
with,
right.
with Alan.
Okay, on page 4 of your rebuttal testimony, you said that that survey was conducted under your supervision by Mr. Thompson. And you said the results of the survey will be filed with A&R prior to August 31st, 2018 in compliance with the MOU you have with them. Have the results of that survey been introduced into this proceeding as evidence, or was it just sent to A&R?
It was sent to A&R. There was a preliminary report that was filed, and then the final report, which supported there was no change in the results. It was, I guess, by comparison, you could think of a memo versus a report. And honestly, I don't know whether that final report has been filed. A&R hasn't.
Because my recollection was, I saw that, and then I went through trying to find this survey if it was, the final report, and I didn't see it in any of the materials. But I'm very new to this case, so I was just trying to figure out if that ever got done, submitted, or put into evidence here. So to your knowledge, A&R may or may not have gotten it, but it's not part of the record here.
I believe that A&R confirmed that they received it. But as far as this proceeding, I guess I would have to defer to folks that know how that works. But I guess I don't know.
Whose job would it have been to send it to A&R pursuant to the MOU, if you know? Once that final results were completed.
Who is legally responsible? I mean, we sent it.
Well, no, I mean, you know, in terms of your group, or was it the subcontractor Thompson, or was?
No, we sent, Arrowwood sent it.
Okay.
So, no, the way that works is that I review the materials and then we forward to the appropriate folks.
I just have two quick questions about the actual reporting on this, or determination on this. There was a bat call classified as from tricolored bats, which was assigned to little brown or red bats based on what was referred to as visual examination. Is visual examination a sufficient standard by which to conclude the classification? Or are the calls analyzed in some other method?
Well, so there's essentially a three-step process. There's the coarse filter that is applied on the front end to determine probable species and looking at frequencies. And then the next step is to feed the calls into the software. And then Kaleidoscope characterizes the calls. And then the analyst, at this point, this would be Alan, will periodically verify if he feels there is a problem with Kaleidoscope, the output from Kaleidoscope, or if he feels that he wants to just confirm what Kaleidoscope did, or if we're dealing with rare, threatened, and endangered species, which obviously has a higher level of significance for the outcome, he may decide. And so in this case, it was more the latter, that he went through an additional step, which is actually he, the analyst, looking at reviewing the call signature through Sonobat, which is another software program. And I think if you look at the report, you'll see the pictures in the back, and that's what he's referring to, because the call of the different species has a different fingerprint. And by looking at that visually, that's what the visual is. And sometimes if there's a problem with Kaleidoscope, you can detect that.
How do you know if there's a problem with Kaleidoscope to go further and verify it through some other means? And you said so if you.
Well, in this case, it wasn't a problem. It was more that he was verifying, which I think is, as a scientist, that's a good step to verify before eliminating options. And I think he actually reclassified and identified little brown bat, which has a higher level of protection than what Kaleidoscope had indicated.
So the statistical results of the maximum likelihood analysis are predictions. They're not fact, fair to say, in terms of interpretation using Kaleidoscope Pro?
It is a software program, so it's a statistical probability analysis.
And then in terms of Sonobat, do you believe that's an acceptable alternative method of verification?
It's an additional method, and it is. I mean, if you go to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife, procedures and protocols, that is an acceptable means for verification.
Okay.
And all of that was, has been reviewed with A&R, with their bat expert, reports, and that's the protocol that's followed.
Was there some reason why the results from the Sonobat process were not provided with the reporting on this?
Well, they are in the report, but I don't know if you have the report, I guess.
Big question.
and you said you were new yesterday, so I'm not sure.
Well, I mean, I got the pre-filed testimony and Mr. Thompson's report from Ipsway. July 26th. Does that sound like
That
the
sounds like
final
the
report?
that sounds like the that where the results were presented, but that doesn't sound like the full report.
Right, that's exhibit CS-DB-6, preliminary results report. So I just didn't see anything provided beyond that preliminary analysis, and there was that notation that there was supposed to be the final report by August 31st. So I just had not seen that report, so I guess we need to figure out if that's in evidence or not. So to your recollection, was there any significant difference between the preliminary versus the final report?
No, there was no difference in the findings. The final report it was more of a documentation of methodology and calibration and all. It was just a thorough detailing. The preliminary was a summary of the results, but the results did not change.
So would you agree with me that it's difficult for someone other than you folks in A&R to consider the actual methodology without seeing that final report?
I'm going to object. I don't think this is in the nature of her questioning her on her report or the analysis that was done. It's really, I think Ms. Dingledine is getting to the question of whether that report should have been filed. It was provided to the agency per the stipulation. The parties have had opportunity to request that. The petitioner has no problem supplementing the record with the final report results, but it was not requested by any party, and this testimony was filed on August 10th, indicating that the results would be sent to the Agency of Natural Resources per the stipulation. So this implication, I think, is that the petitioner...
Let me just ask Ms. Barton a question. Ms. Barton, is it your understanding that the petitioner has satisfied the requirement of you to conduct the study in the summer of 2018?
Yes.
And that report is available? The final report, to your knowledge, is available?
Yes.
Is that something that you want, Ms. Dingledine?
Yes, because I think that we are entitled to see that and cross-examine the witness on it.
Recognizing that A&R has accepted it as satisfying its requirement and its stipulation.
I would also interject, if I may, that it has been over 30 days. This testimony was filed. If not only was there discovery and an opportunity for discovery, but if there's an objection that the level of testimony was incomplete, it should have been made. What I'm concerned about is I believe we do not want to have an extension of this proceeding because this party had failed to request and follow.
I don't understand why we have to request a piece of evidence that is being, given from one party to another when everyone's supposed to know about this and have access to all the information. You have an EPUC thing now, you're supposed to be able to go on there, see everything that's been filed in the case. I don't understand why it's my client's burden 20 days after something was supposed to be sent to A&R and nobody cares about sharing that information with all the parties who have standing on this very criteria, and then we have to listen. I'll stop.
If I may, there are many instances where there's follow-up work that's done by the parties under stipulation, follow-up work on aesthetics, there's follow-up work with respect to historic sites and reporting to the various agencies that supervise those resources, and this is very much in the nature of that.
And Fernand, when was the date that the A&R MOU was filed?
That was June 20, 2018.
And Exhibit CS-DB-6, the preliminary is filed.
August 10th.
And we have been in active discovery until just this last week. So I would suggest that interveners, like all parties, had the opportunity to inquire of A&R or of the petitioner as to whether or not that condition and stipulation had been achieved.
Hang on just a minute. The timing on this. They just said that they submitted this in what date? The final report to A&R pursuant to the MOU was in June or July?
No. The stipulation with the agency was filed in EPUC in July.
Okay, so when was the final report sent to A&R?
The witness has answered that. That was recently around, the testimony said August 31. Do you recall the specific date?
I don't know exactly the date.
I do know that it was after the rebuttal testimony deadline for the petitioner, and the petitioner disclosed that this was, that the preliminary results were provided. She's already testified that the final report doesn't change anything, and your clients had the opportunity to request it. We've been very upfront about this, and I will say we have no problem filing that as a record request or however the hearing officer would like to have it.
I would suggest, go ahead, Mr. You appear to have a question about it.
Well, yeah, it's just really troubling. I mean, this is a secret thing going on that my clients who are pro ses, they don't know what's going on. Did we read this thing where we get something on August 10th?
Is there a question, Mr.
Yes. August 10th, we get this, preliminary thing, and it says August 31st is going to be a final report, and it's 20 days later. It's been, gone from one party to the other, and we've been left out in the cold. That, to me, suggests that I don't understand why that happened, but why is it my client's burden to go chasing after something when people are, giving evidence to one another that is referred to in pre-filed testimony, says that it's going to be submitted by a certain date, and then nobody ever gives it to us. That's my concern. I don't understand.
I understand. Thank you. Are there additional questions for Ms. Barker?
I have none.
Just one moment. Just for purposes of the record, I am maintaining an objection to Mr. Thompson's reporting, his pre-filed testimony. It is hearsay the way it's been introduced through Ms. Barton. No disrespect meant to Ms. Barton. I understand she's a very accomplished scientist, but not in this particular area of expertise. She doesn't have the same certification, nor has she ever conducted that surveys. While there may have been some supervision, we do not think that the hearsay rules should permit folks to not come and actually be cross-examined to be able to answer questions on the actual survey.
The hearing officer has already admitted this evidence into the record. The request, the motion was not made in writing in advance. I can walk through the hearsay rule exceptions, but I just don't think it's
I also
necessary.
note that this is an administrative hearing and not a civil court. And we have the option in an administrative hearing to accept a certain amount of hearsay. I note your objection. Thank you.
That's all I have.
I just want to, I think I did ask this question, but I want to make sure I ask it again to make sure I don't have to do some more work. So it's your understanding, Ms. Barton, that the petitioner has met the requirements of the stipulation or of the A&R MOU at paragraph 2C, which is the one that says do the test during the summertime.
Yes, the test was conducted in July.
So I don't have to write a condition in any CPG in this case that requires it?
No.
Okay, thank you. I want to thank you for your testimony. You may sit down. It's now 10 minutes to 12. We'll take a 1-hour break until 10 minutes before 1 o'clock.